There comes a moment in life when everything that once felt certain begins to dissolve. The achievements that once defined you lose their flavor. The roles you played, success, recognition, admiration, start to feel like costumes worn by someone else. It is not that the world has changed, it is that you have. For Tolstoy, that moment was not a passing melancholy, but an awakening that felt like collapse. He had everything a man of his time could desire: wealth, fame, respect, a family, a legacy. And yet somewhere between comfort and applause, he began to ask a question that no success could silence. Why? That small word became a storm. Why live? Why write? Why wake up every morning to repeat the same rituals of survival if everything, health, love, status, body, would eventually vanish? The question did not come from despair. It came from lucidity. He had seen through the illusion that accomplishment equals meaning, and once you see that illusion clearly, it cannot be unseen. This is the essence of the existential crisis, not a collapse of life, but a collapse of false meaning. Psychology defines it as the moment when your constructed identity, the self you have built from goals, praise, and social roles, no longer satisfies the deeper need for coherence. It is the realization that I am not the same as what I do, and when that illusion breaks, what remains is a vast silence. Tolstoy's crisis represents the silence after the applause. It is the point when the noise of the external world fades and the only sound left is your own unanswered question. What is the purpose of a life that inevitably ends? For most people, this question hides beneath distractions: work, ambition, relationships, possessions. But Tolstoy had reached the top of every mountain the world could offer, and from that height he discovered the void. In modern psychological terms, what Tolstoy experienced is a collapse of symbolic meaning systems. Humans create stories about success, love, morality, eternity, to give structure to existence. These stories are essential. They protect us from the terror of the unknown. But when the story you live by begins to crumble, you face the raw truth that life itself is not obliged to mean anything. That realization can feel like death, because in a sense it is, the death of the self you thought you were. It is the threshold between the constructed self and the authentic self. Tolstoy stood at that threshold. He wrote that he feared not physical death, but the spiritual emptiness of a life lived without purpose. He realized that the fear of death is inseparable from the fear of meaninglessness, because to die without having truly lived, without having touched something real, is the deepest terror the human mind can face. Existential psychology calls this moment the crisis of authenticity. It happens when you no longer believe the roles you play. You begin to see that much of what you called your life was a performance, a defense against the void, a way of feeling in control of something uncontrollable. Tolstoy's journals reveal the slow unraveling of that mask. He stopped seeing himself as a writer, as a nobleman, as a thinker, and began seeing himself simply as a being. And in that simplicity, he confronted the unbearable truth, that being alive in itself offers no ready-made answer. The world does not owe you meaning. You must create it, or fall into despair. Psychology today recognizes that despair is not always a symptom of illness. Sometimes it is a sign of awakening. It is the soul refusing to live on borrowed meaning. It is the point where denial ends and consciousness begins. This is what Tolstoy discovered, that no amount of knowledge or success can substitute for a direct experience of purpose. You can write about truth, teach truth, analyze truth, and still not live it. And this realization does not destroy you. It humbles you. It strips away illusions so that what remains is real. Fragile, uncertain, but real. To lose meaning, paradoxically, is to stand at the door of truth, because it is only when you admit that life has no automatic purpose that you can begin to create one consciously. The existential crisis, then, is not an end. It is a beginning. It is the invitation to live not from fear or ambition, but from awareness, to stop running from death and start understanding life. After the collapse of illusion comes the ache of emptiness. When all that once seemed meaningful loses its weight, the mind begins a restless search. It looks for new beliefs to hold, new systems to replace the broken ones. This is what Tolstoy faced. Not the despair of losing everything, but the disorientation of having no foundation left to stand on. He had reached a kind of spiritual zero, no longer believing in the promises of wealth or the prestige of intellect, yet not ready to embrace faith blindly. He stood between two worlds, the rational and the spiritual, and found both unsatisfying. Psychologically, this is a moment of existential disintegration. The personality built around external validation begins to dissolve, and the deeper self, which had been buried under noise and identity, starts to emerge. But emergence is not peaceful. It is confusing, painful, and often lonely. Humans are meaning-seeking beings. We cannot survive long in a vacuum of purpose. When the old structures collapse, the psyche scrambles to rebuild coherence. That rebuilding is the beginning of authentic spirituality. Not religion in the formal sense, but the rediscovery of a direct relationship with existence itself. Tolstoy's writings from this period reveal a man wrestling with the limits of intellect. He realized that logic, no matter how sharp, could not answer the simplest questions of the soul. What am I here for? What does it mean to live well? Why love if everything passes? Reason could describe life, but it could not justify it. And that is where his search deepened, from thought into being. Modern psychology calls this the transition from the rational self to the experiential self. It is the shift from explaining life to actually living it. For Tolstoy, this meant confronting a truth that many avoid, that meaning is not discovered intellectually. It is felt through connection, with others, with nature, with one's own conscience. He began to understand that truth cannot be possessed. It must be practiced. It lives not in theories but in the way we act, speak, and relate to life itself. And so his search became less about finding answers and more about learning to live without them. This stage of the existential journey is crucial. It is where many people either rebuild a false certainty, clinging to ideology, addiction, or distraction, or begin to cultivate a deeper form of presence. Tolstoy chose the latter, though not easily. He discovered that freedom is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to suffer consciously, to stay awake within discomfort instead of numbing it. In psychological terms, this is called acceptance-based awareness, the recognition that meaning grows not from control, but from engagement. To live meaningfully is to stop demanding that life be different and to start asking how one can participate in it honestly. But this acceptance requires humility. For Tolstoy, humility meant seeing the limits of intellect and returning to something simpler, not ignorance, but sincerity. He began to admire the peasants who worked his land, not for their hardship, but for their clarity. They lived close to reality. They suffered, they loved, they prayed, and they did not need to explain the universe to feel part of it. What he envied in them was not their faith itself, but their integration. They did not separate thought from action or belief from living. Their meaning was not abstract, it was embodied. That realization marked the beginning of Tolstoy's inner transformation. He began to suspect that truth is not found in books, but in the way one relates to life each day. From a psychological perspective, this marks the passage from existential anxiety to existential responsibility. When you no longer find external meaning ready-made, you realize that meaning must be created through participation. Every act, no matter how small, becomes a statement about who you are and what you value. Tolstoy began to see that meaning is not a discovery but a practice. It is built moment by moment through honesty, compassion, and integrity. You cannot find meaning in the abstract. You can only live it in the concrete. In this, Tolstoy anticipated what modern psychology would later describe as the self-transcendent orientation, the idea that fulfillment arises when the self connects to something larger than itself. It does not matter whether that something is God, nature, art, or humanity. What matters is the movement beyond the confines of ego. He realized that his despair had grown in the narrow space of self-centered consciousness. He had been living for his own image, his own recognition, his own achievements. And as long as life was about him, it remained empty. Meaning, he saw, begins where self-obsession ends. But this insight did not end his struggle. Like many who awakened to the fragility of existence, he faced an inner paradox: how to live with awareness of life's impermanence without sinking into despair. The answer he found lay not in denial, but in compassion. The more he accepted his own vulnerability, the more he began to see it mirrored in others. Everyone, he realized, carries the same quiet fear, the fear of insignificance, of vanishing without a trace. And in that shared fragility, he discovered connection, not intellectual but human. And that connection, fragile as it was, began to feel like the beginning of truth. Once the weight of nihilism begins to loosen, the mind enters a space of potential. Tolstoy discovered that meaning is not a destination but a process, a daily engagement with life that transcends mere survival or achievement. This stage is not about answers but about orientation, how one chooses to inhabit existence in the face of uncertainty. Psychologically, it is the moment where reflection shifts into action-informed awareness. The thinker becomes the practitioner, contemplation becomes participation. Tolstoy realized that understanding suffering was insufficient unless it translated into how he lived, loved, and acted. One of the deepest lessons he learned is the paradox of letting go to gain. He understood that clinging to worldly desires, wealth, status, even intellectual recognition, creates suffering because it anchors identity to impermanent structures. The more one clings, the more one is exposed to disappointment and despair. This is the essence of psychological detachment, the ability to participate fully in life without being consumed by attachment. Tolstoy observed that those who live closest to reality, like the peasants, naturally cultivate this detachment. Their lives are not free from suffering, yet they maintain a groundedness that comes from accepting limitations rather than resisting them. For Tolstoy, detachment was not indifference. It was clarity of perception, seeing both beauty and suffering without being consumed by either. This practice created an inner space where compassion could arise authentically. Compassion became the cornerstone of his renewed existence. He recognized that self-transcendence is not achieved through withdrawal from the world, but through active engagement in alleviating the suffering of others. Every act of kindness, every attempt to reduce pain is an act of existential affirmation. It asserts that life has worth beyond individual ego. This realization also reshapes the understanding of death. Where once the inevitability of mortality seemed a threat, it now became a mirror for how to live. The finitude of life clarifies what is meaningful, emphasizing presence, integrity, and ethical action. Death is no longer a shadow that haunts the soul, but a teacher that illuminates the value of each moment. Tolstoy's psychological journey reflects the integration of existential awareness. He moves from despair to purposeful vulnerability, acknowledging fragility while committing to acts that connect him to a broader human reality. This is a profound psychological shift, from a self-centered framework to a relational and value-driven consciousness. He also discovered that the pursuit of superficial pleasures, while temporarily soothing, cannot replace this deeper engagement. The honey on the branch, as he described in his parable, is sweet but fleeting. Only sustained attention to meaning through moral and spiritual practice provides lasting fulfillment. In essence, he learns that happiness is derivative, emerging naturally from the alignment of life with principles that transcend personal desire. Detachment, compassion, and ethical engagement together form the architecture of his renewed life. Tolstoy realized that the human capacity for suffering is universal, but so is the capacity for resilience, love, and moral creativity. He turned inward not to isolate himself, but to cultivate a psychological and spiritual clarity that allowed him to face the world without being overwhelmed. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with modern understandings of post-traumatic growth. Crises of meaning can become opportunities for deeper insight, reorientation of values, and the development of enduring purpose. Tolstoy exemplifies how profound distress, when consciously processed, transforms into a wisdom that integrates intellect, emotion, and spirit. Yet this transformation requires discipline and courage. It is easy to regress into cynicism, distraction, or despair. Tolstoy's choice was radical. He restructured his entire life around simplicity, humility, and service. He rejected ostentation and prioritized actions that reflected his emerging ethical framework. In psychological terms, he externalized his values through behavior, embodying a life coherent with insight rather than theory. Importantly, Tolstoy did not idealize suffering. He recognized its burden. But he also realized that suffering becomes meaningful when observed with consciousness and compassion, rather than resisted or denied. Pain, loss, and mortality are inevitable, yet they can be transformed into teachers that deepen self-awareness, moral clarity, and human empathy. By living through these principles, Tolstoy exemplified the practical psychology of existential resolution, acceptance of impermanence and the limits of rational understanding, detachment from ego-driven desires, ethical and compassionate engagement with others, integration of inner experience into outward action. Through this framework, life ceases to be a meaningless sequence of days and becomes a continuous practice of value, presence, and meaning-making. It is no longer about finding an ultimate answer, but about participating fully and responsibly in the unfolding of existence. In essence, Tolstoy's psychological evolution demonstrates that meaning is not discovered passively. It is cultivated through conscious living. The existential crisis that once paralyzed him became the catalyst for profound psychological and spiritual maturation. By turning inward to face despair and outward to connect with the suffering and dignity of others, he forged a life coherent with authentic values. capable of sustaining both peace and purpose. Tolstoy's journey teaches that existential crises are not merely obstacles to overcome. They are mirrors reflecting the deeper architecture of the human psyche. When life strips away certainty, status, and comfort, it exposes the essential questions. Who am I? What matters? How should I live? These questions, though uncomfortable, are the very foundation of self-awareness and emotional maturity. Psychologically, confronting these questions is both painful and transformative. Tolstoy's experience reveals that despair is not the opposite of meaning, but a precondition for it. Only when the illusions of permanence dissolve can one begin to perceive values that endure beyond fleeting pleasure, fame, or wealth. The void left by these illusions is not emptiness to fear, but space to cultivate authenticity, compassion, and insight. Tolstoy's reflections on life highlight the interdependence of acceptance and action. Acceptance of mortality, impermanence, and human suffering is not passive resignation. Instead, it is a conscious acknowledgement of reality, which then informs ethical and purposeful action. This is the psychological key. Clarity about the limits of existence allows freedom from fear, enabling choices that are grounded in meaningful values rather than reactive impulses. He observed that people respond to life's absurdity in four main ways: avoidance, distraction, surrender, or mindful engagement. The first three offer temporary relief, but cannot resolve the underlying tension of existence. Only the fourth, awareness, ethical practice, and compassionate connection, provides sustained psychological equilibrium and existential fulfillment. This is the essential lesson. Meaning is cultivated, not discovered, and it emerges most clearly through conscious participation in life rather than passive reflection or escapism. Tolstoy also demonstrates the profound power of spiritual integration. He did not rely on external authority or institutionalized religion. Instead, he turned inward, reflecting deeply on the human heart, observing the lives of others and aligning action with enduring moral principles. Faith in this context is less about dogma and more about trust in values that transcend personal ego: compassion, humility, service, and love. It is a form of psychological anchoring, a framework for navigating life's uncertainties while maintaining coherence and purpose. The transformation he underwent illustrates a crucial psychological principle. Purpose is relational, not solitary. A life centered solely on personal gain or intellectual pursuit is vulnerable to despair. Meaning arises through connection, to others, to ethical principles, and to a sense of transcendent value that endures beyond the self. Every act of care, every moral choice, every effort to alleviate suffering strengthens the foundation of a purposeful life. Moreover, Tolstoy shows that simplicity amplifies insight. By reducing the distractions of excess, ego-driven ambition, and superficial pleasure, he could attend fully to life's essentials. This aligns with modern psychological research. Mindfulness, intentional living, and value-consistent action are among the most reliable predictors of sustained well-being and resilience. The quieter life he cultivated was not deprivation, it was clarity. Clarity that allowed him to act with moral integrity and emotional depth. His story also teaches that existential crises are cyclical and enduring. Life continually presents challenges, losses, and uncertainties. Yet the practice Tolstoy developed, reflection, detachment, compassion, and conscious action, serves as a psychological and spiritual toolkit for navigating recurring crises. It is less about achieving permanent certainty and more about cultivating resilience, coherence, and meaningful engagement despite uncertainty. Finally, Tolstoy's example inspires a reflection on mortality and human legacy. He did not attain immortality through wealth or acclaim, but through influencing hearts, minds, and lives. The measure of existence, he demonstrated, is not in external accumulation, but in the quality of consciousness and the depth of ethical engagement. In the face of death, a life lived with integrity, compassion, and purpose becomes luminous, leaving a quiet, enduring impact on the world. In conclusion, the psychological and spiritual lessons from Tolstoy's life can be summarized as follows. Confront despair courageously. Existential questioning is a catalyst, not a curse. Detach from transient attachments. Freedom from clinging clarifies perception and reduces suffering. Engage compassionately. Ethical and relational action transforms awareness into meaning. Integrate reflection into daily life. Consistent alignment of values, thought, and behavior sustains purpose. Accept mortality and impermanence. These realities illuminate what is truly meaningful. Even amidst the uncertainty, suffering, and impermanence that define human existence, one can create a life of depth, purpose, and profound emotional resonance. Tolstoy's journey demonstrates that the path to fulfillment is not found in avoiding life as difficulties, but in embracing them with courage, consciousness, and compassion, allowing each moment to contribute to a life well lived.